Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and today I'll be talking about the Old Testament laws. Very often people, usually atheists, but there are occasionally Abrahamic religious followers who do it, bring up ancient Near East law codes as proof of how barbaric ancient people were. Now people who do this likely have never read a book on ancient Near East law and just assume it to function as a penal code. There are problems with this, however. Let's start out with another ancient law code that people are familiar with, the Code of Hammurabi. People usually bring up the code to show how unoriginal the Old Testament is, when in reality, wouldn't we expect similar laws for a lot of these cases irregardless of its origins? I would imagine a god would include in his law code not to kill people, even though other people may know that already. But anyway, guess how many times the Hammurabi was mentioned in recorded judicial decisions? 0. They never were. Why is this the case? Well, I'll let the book by the scholar Delbert that's entitled Covenant, The History of a Biblical Idea tell why. There is no evidence that any collection of Near Eastern laws functioned as a written code that was applied by a strict method of exegesis to individual cases. As far as we can tell, these bodies of laws served educational purposes and gave expression to what was regarded as just in typical cases, but they left considerable latitude to local courts for determining the right in individual suits. They aided local courts without controlling them. Basically, the law codes functioned more for educational purposes than penal notions like we know them, typically as. They trained and educated judges whom would consult them on difficult cases. They were treated as a didactic source with educational value rather than a reason to do an action. Basically, what would happen is, let's say in the case of a rape of a man's wife, the judges would consult the law codes and decide a punishment based on what they learned from them. The law codes wouldn't be a practical authority, but would have persuasive authority. LeFebvre in Collections, Codes, and Torah mentioned how Ezra didn't see the law codes as prescriptive, but rather as descriptive of Yahweh's ideals for the world, and they were authoritative but not binding. To nail this on the head, here's a quote from Jonathan Vroom on the Code of the Hammurabi and its relation to ancient Near East law. In his paper, Law, Authority, and Interpretation in the Ancient World, the Origin of Legal Obligation in Early Judaism, he states the following: given the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever that the LH or any other Mesopotamian law collections were applied or interpreted as practical authorities which address the threats to the rule of law, while the Omen literature was extensively interpreted, it seems highly unlikely that the Law of Hammurabi was ever treated as practical authority. Page 70. The Old Testament legal provisions were different than the other Mesopotamian law collections in the fact that they were grounded on God rather than the monarchs, which has been used to suggest legal binding, although this makes the unwarranted assumption that authoritative texts must impose a binding obligation when this is not the case and there is evidence against it. To show how scholars can come to this decision, let's take Deuteronomy as an example. It was clearly ideologically motivated like other law codes of the time, and its use of a hortatory style and mass usage of motive clauses suggest it was used for educational purposes, as that is where these elements are most commonly found in educational works. These, along with other measures such as literary dependence and interpretive changes, etc., goes to show this fact. How the law really worked was that it was case laws where the same violation would be punished with different penalties, where the wrong party had the right to choose which penalty or penalties to impose on the offender. I'll give the link to a Tektontv video which goes into more detail on the subject. Well, that is all for today. This is Mr. Brass saying goodbye and get wise.